One of the keys to a happy marriage is being an effective problem solver. Now, all marriages have problems. All marriage gardens have weeds and bugs, if you will. Sometimes, though, we go about getting rid of those weeds and bugs in unhelpful ways. Some of those unhelpful ways I refer to as weed eater techniques. Now, you can imagine that if we had a beautiful flower bed or a vegetable garden and it needed weeding, we wouldn't take a weed eater to it, would we? Because that would destroy not only the weeds, but all of the lovely flowers and plants that we wanted to be there as well. Weeding a marriage garden takes a gentler technique. It takes hand weeding. But I wanted to talk for just a minute about what some of those weed eater techniques are, some of those things that we ought to avoid when we're trying to effectively solve problems in marriage. One of the first weed eater techniques we need to avoid is what's called a harsh startup. When something is important that we need to talk about or something's been bothering us, it's okay to talk about it, but we ought not to start it off in a harsh way with some statement like, "Honey, you're such a bonehead, I can't believe you forgot to take out the garbage." That's not helpful. A second of those weed eater techniques is what's called criticism. We're all familiar with criticism, and we don't like it. Criticism is when we attack someone else. The third of those weed eater techniques is contempt. Now, contempt is a little bit more toxic than criticism. It's when we begin to insult our partner, their personality, their intelligence. It may include things like eye rolling or other sorts of rude and inconsiderate gestures. Another of those weed eater techniques is what's called defensiveness. Now, you can imagine if you feel like you've been criticized or your partner's been contemptuous towards you, you might be defensive. It's a natural reaction. We put up our defenses, and sometimes we even try and return volley by criticizing them in return. This is not helpful. Another of those weed eater techniques is what's called stonewalling. Now, you can imagine if you've been criticized and feel defensive, that eventually you may want to shut down. And that's what stonewalling is. It's withdrawing either emotionally or physically from the relationship. When you get to this point, relationships really are becoming fragile. And one last weed eater technique that I would like to mention is called failed repair attempts. Sometimes we make efforts to try and say we're sorry or to make sure that the relationship's okay. And nothing's quite as damaging as one partner saying, "Hey, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that, dear. I was way out of line." And the person to whom he's saying that, or to whom she's saying that, saying, "Well, I don't accept your apology. You're just going to have to suffer." Those are weed eater techniques, and they are not helpful in our marriage relationships. Those are things that we really ought to avoid.
You can learn more about the Marriage Garden and other family programs by contacting your local county extension agent. You can find a wealth of tips and programs at arfamilies.org. You can also buy a copy of the new Marriage Garden book at the Extension website or at your local book dealer.